It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. Governor Evers has signed 2 bills into law that are designed to advance the state's investment in nuclear power. Together, the new laws will identify a location in the state to build a nuclear power plant and create a board to advance nuclear power and fusion technology. So what do these developments mean for Wisconsin's energy future? For that, we turn to Paul Wilson, a professor of nuclear engineering and chair of the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Engineering Physics at UW-Madison. Paul, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thanks, Kate. It's great to be here.
You have long supported the growth of nuclear energy here in Wisconsin. What stands out to you about these new laws?
I think the new laws are a great step forward for the state to be exploring more nuclear energy. The one about the siting, we'll have the Public Service Commission identify maybe a variety of sites and look for what the characteristics might be for a good site for new nuclear power plants. It could be something like the Kewanee station that used to have a nuclear power plant.
Which is decommissioned.
Which is now has been shut down for about 10 or 12 years and is currently being decommissioned. It also could be transitioning from coal plants to nuclear. As we shut down coal plants, a lot of infrastructure at those sites may be suitable to help support and make it easier to build a new nuclear power plant there. So I think that's one of the major things that I'm excited about. The other piece of legislation creates this nuclear board at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, and with the hopes to host a summit here in a couple of years, a global nuclear summit.
2028.
2028. I think the legislation points to our new engineering building as a place to hold that summit. But the meat of that is really about finding a way to connect Wisconsin manufacturing into the supply chain for nuclear energy, fission technology as we're building today, but also evolving and emerging fusion energy technology. And so there's a lot of manufacturing capacity historically and today in Wisconsin, and figuring out how they can be part of what we hope will be a rapidly expanding need for supply chain.
Rapidly expanding need. When you look at the Public Service Commission's most recent strategic energy assessment, nuclear energy accounted for about 16% of the energy generated by Wisconsin electric providers in 2023. What is the potential for nuclear power in our state's future energy mix?
There's a lot of opportunity for more nuclear in this state. If you look at nationally, it's about 20%. It used to be 20% here in Wisconsin before Kewanee was shut down. You look at some of the leaders that people think about in France, where it's 75%. Ontario and in Canada is very heavily nuclear. Some states in this country have a lot of nuclear energy. So there's a lot of opportunity in Wisconsin, particularly because we're still relying pretty heavily on coal and natural gas for electricity in Wisconsin compared to some of the other states.
Thinking about those other states, according to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there are 94 licensed nuclear power plants nationwide, 11 being in Illinois. What can Wisconsin learn from Illinois about building nuclear power?
Illinois built all those nuclear power plants some time ago. Most of the nuclear power plants...
Would it be like 1970s?
All but 2 nuclear power plants operating in the country today started their construction in the 1970s. Including the 2 still operating in Wisconsin at Point Beach. There's a lot of new things to learn about building nuclear power plants. The most recent place to do it was in Georgia. 2 nuclear power plants went online in the last couple of years down there. And so there were some big lessons that we learned there. I think if you look at what it takes to support nuclear energy, Illinois has made some big steps recently, in particular including nuclear in their clean energy credit program. And so they actually went through a period where there were challenges to keeping some of their nuclear power plants open. And across their government, bipartisan, said it wouldn't make sense to shut these down and start burning more fossil fuels. And so how do we make sure that we include them in the right programs so that we can keep this low-carbon technology operating?
What would be a roadblock to keeping a nuclear power plant going?
For the last 10 years or so, it's been economic challenges that come from very cheap natural gas. Starting in the late 2010s or late 2000s, 2008 or so, when hydrofracking became the main way we get natural gas prices plummeted and have stayed low. There was a blip around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It went up a little bit, but it's back down again. And so cheap natural gas is the real competition financially. But it's also very volatile. because most of its cost comes from what the natural gas costs, and we don't know what that's going to be in the future.
And nuclear energy, nuclear power has a more consistent cost?
Yeah, the vast share of the cost of nuclear energy comes from building the plant. And so once it's built, you have a pretty good idea of what your costs are going to be. They may be slightly higher than the cheapest natural gas power plant, but it doesn't emit anything into the atmosphere, carbon or otherwise, and so it comes with those benefits.
Ballpark, what does it cost to build one of these?
Depends
now.
Depends how big.
Not in the 1970s.
Depends how big you're building it. We sort of, if you're building a big 1,000 megawatt power plant or even bigger, the ones that are built in Georgia were that size. They came in pretty expensive. But it's the first time we've done it in 20 years. What do we expect that to be? We expect that might be a $10 billion with a B investment. Those large power plants, there's a big price tag to get it going, but it's pretty cheap to operate and keep it running once you do that.
We're talking about nuclear power after Governor Evers signed 2 bills designed to advance nuclear energy in the state. Paul Wilson is here, the Granger Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Chair of the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Engineering Physics at UW-Madison. Paul, there are safety concerns from people who live in states with these nuclear power plants. Is it safe to live near one of these plants?
It's very safe to live near them. In fact, while certainly people have concerns, the communities that host nuclear power plants tend to be the most favorable. The highest favorability of nuclear energy comes from those communities. Those communities are familiar. They live next door to people who operate and work at the power plant. It gives them a different sense of confidence because they know the people and can build some trust around with people. If you look at nuclear energy historically, there have been a few major accidents, but for the most part, the track record of nuclear energy is pretty good. When you compare it to other energy technologies, the health impacts, both from regular operation, which, coal and natural gas putting out pollutants into the atmosphere is got regular, it's got health impacts from day-to-day regular operation, but also from accident kind of situations. If you look at accidents in mining coal, accidents in natural gas explosions and things like that, it's much more dangerous to have that infrastructure in our society than it is to have nuclear energy.
So as the Public Service Commission studies potential sites, what will they consider? What might they be judging in these potential sites?
I think there's a lot of factors to consider. I mentioned a few at the beginning. One of them is access to the infrastructure to connect it to the grid. If you look at this part of the country and many parts of the country, one of the biggest obstacles to any new electricity technology going online is power lines and the other infrastructure that's needed to connect it to the grid. And this is one of the reasons the coal to nuclear transition is so exciting. The Department of Energy under President Biden did a big report looking at sites across the country and identified a handful in Wisconsin that might be suitable for transitioning from coal to nuclear. Because they have that infrastructure. They also have a workforce that, as a coal plant is being shut down, there's a workforce that could quite easily be retrained to work in a nuclear power plant. And then after that, you've got to look at some of the environmental circumstances, primarily cooling water. Lake shores in Wisconsin provide a good source of cooling water, particularly large lakes, that's the Great Lakes. Otherwise, if it's on a river, it would probably need to have cooling towers. And then you've got other questions about can you consume the water from those rivers and still have enough river flow for the other needs of the community and the ecosystem?
Let's stop there on the environmental point. Radioactive waste is a byproduct from nuclear reactors. It's hazardous, very hazardous. How would Wisconsin handle getting rid of nuclear waste and the spent reactor fuel?
Right, used nuclear fuel is one of the big stumbling blocks for expansion of nuclear energy. Right now, all the used nuclear fuel that's generated is stored at the reactor sites where it was generated for the time being. The good news is it's a very small quantity. One of the best things about nuclear energy is that it's so dense, energy dense, that we don't need very much fuel and we don't produce very much fuel. To put that in context, if you take all the used nuclear fuel generated in this country ever, it would fit in Camp Randall Stadium about 25 feet high. Another measure, if you got all of your energy from nuclear energy for your entire life, then your personal contribution would be about 1 soda can's worth of used nuclear fuel. So that scale makes it a real benefit. The other thing is that it's solid contained material. So unlike emissions to the environment or to the water to the watershed, it's pretty easy to track. We have ID numbers on all of it. We know where it is. We can log it. And so over century timescales, it's a very easy waste product to manage. The challenge we're facing in this country still is what we do with it beyond that over the longer time frame. Other countries have made more progress. The political economic makeup of this country makes it a little more challenging than some other countries. I think the best place to look for comparison is Canada, which has a lot of similar, technical and political challenges that we have here. And they've cited their first underground repository and are looking to start looking for their second.
Well, I want to understand a little bit what's driving this, because there are these massive power needs on the horizon from these yet to be built data centers. Is that pushing us toward nuclear power?
I think that's some of the push right now, to be sure. In the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a lot of focus on that energy demand growth. There's other kinds of electrification that we anticipate, electric vehicles. Electrification is often the easiest way to decarbonize industry, and that's going to increase demand as well. But these data centers are really we just heard in the last news segment about that. And so I think that's driving it a lot, and states around the country don't want to be left out of that game. And so I think what's created the interest at our legislature is making sure that this state is prepared for energy growth if they need it. I would say, in my opinion, our legislature has not paid a lot of attention to energy for some time. And so it's refreshing to see them looking at it with whatever solutions they want to explore, because I think our clean energy future is an important thing to be thinking about.
Paul, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Paul Wilson is the Granger Professor of Nuclear Engineering and Chair of the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Engineering Physics at UW-Madison. We've been talking about recently signed bills that are new efforts to bring more nuclear power online here in Wisconsin. Coming up, PFAS chemicals are a top pollution concern in Wisconsin and elsewhere. The author of a new book traces the rise of the forever chemicals.
I would just encourage people in Wisconsin who are concerned about this issue to encourage the state to be more aggressive in regulating these chemicals.
The author of They Poisoned the World, that's next from WPR News. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. It sounds like something out of science fiction. A scientist discovers a substance strong enough to contain nuclear chemicals and realizes that it's toxic to humans right away when factory workers get chemical burns and breathing problems. But the compound, it ends up in a wide array of consumer products: pots and pans, firefighting foam, furniture, clothing, contact lenses, lipstick, and more. It's the story of PFAS chemicals used in Teflon, carpet treatments, and many other applications, and now a pollution concern in waters around Wisconsin and the country. Jim Boyson of French Island is one of the thousands of Wisconsinites who have dealt with the consequences of PFAS pollution. He talked to WPR earlier this year.
How do you get rid of it? You can't water your lawn because it'll go down through the ground into your well, right back where you got it from. So you're pretty much at the will of the PFAS, actually. Our kids all drank it. Our company all drank it. We used to have parties over here. They all drank it. We've been drinking it that long. I've got thyroid problems, probably from that, because it started since then. That's another reason why we're so enthused about getting this thing taken care of. You just get kind of a guilt feeling knowing that you were feeding poison to your friends and your children. That's the hardest part for me to take.
In her new book, investigative journalist Mariah Blake traces the history of PFAS chemicals and communities dealing with PFAS pollution. The book is called They Poisoned the World: Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. Rob Ferrett talked to her earlier this week.
Mariah, there's been this slow burn of PFAS stories and concerns here in Wisconsin, around the country. What led you into your reporting on this and exploring the origins and evolution of this problem?
Well, my interest in the topic is actually deeply personal. So I first began researching toxic chemicals when I was pregnant with my son back in 2010. I knew that certain chemicals were known to be extremely harmful to developing fetuses. So I took steps to try to remove these chemicals from my home. So I went through my cabinets and got rid of all of my plastic food containers and dishes. I researched what was in the water in my hometown, which is Washington, D.C. And I discovered that there were traces of toxic chemicals in the drinking water there. Eventually, I stumbled upon a complaint for a lawsuit that was filed by a group of West Virginia residents. It involved a forever chemical known as PFOA that is used to make Teflon, and that was in the drinking water of this community in West Virginia. And as I dug into the court record, it became clear to me that this chemical was extremely toxic, that it was in the blood of virtually every person on the planet, and that it didn't break down. But that industry had withheld this information.
I want to take things back to the origin. If you had asked me last week, before I read your book, where was PFAS first used, I would have said consumer products, Teflon, maybe fire extinguisher foam. I don't know. No, it turns out the Manhattan Project, right? Research on developing atomic weapons. How did that lead to the rise of the use of these chemicals?
That's a really good question. And this was one of the things I was most astonished to discover in the course of my research. And that is that forever chemicals, or PFAS, were first developed by the US government as part of the top secret Manhattan Project. As you said, they were needed for uranium enrichment because uranium enrichment involved this substance that was so caustic that would burn through everything, including stainless steel. So they needed substances that could withstand this highly caustic chemical that was used in uranium manufacturing. And Manhattan Project scientists ultimately determined that the only substances that could do this were substances that brought together fluorine and carbon, which together form the strongest bond in chemistry. So they launched this elaborate program involving the top chemists in laboratories all across the country to develop what were then known as fluorocarbons, but what are now known as PFAS. And they began mass producing them in collaboration with DuPont at a factory in New Jersey. It was clear from the outset that these were dangerous chemicals. So at the plants where they were manufacturing them, fires and explosions were commonplace. Workers were constantly being hospitalized with chemical burns and breathing problems or worse. But it wasn't just the workers who were affected. Farmers downwind of these plants quickly began to complain that their peach crops were burning up, that their cows were so crippled they couldn't stand. They had to graze by crawling on their bellies. And in some cases, farm workers who ate the produce they picked also fell ill.
Sometimes I think people think, okay, we used this chemical for decades, a long time, and didn't know, right? It only slowly emerged that this was a problem. What you're saying there, though, is early days, literally the first years of use of this, we were seeing environmental and health impacts.
Yes, well, so the farmers' complaints alarmed Manhattan Project officials, so they actually began researching the health effects of these chemicals in the 1940s. As part of this broader program to research the health effects of special Manhattan Project materials, including uranium and plutonium. And as early as 1947, Manhattan Project scientists had determined that these chemicals were toxic and that they were accumulating in human blood. And this is one of the things that makes these chemicals so dangerous. As your listeners probably know, they stay in the body for many years. So government scientists had an indication that this was the case as early as 1947. But even more concerning, by the 1970s, scientists who were working with this program, which continued after the war under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission, had discovered that these chemicals were accumulating in the blood of people all across the country, including in places where there was no known source of contamination. And that discovery is what led to concern within industry about these chemicals.
A little detour here is something I think we should point out. Sometimes when we know there's something that could be toxic, lead, for example, it might exist independently in the environment. When we're talking about PFAS chemicals, this is a category of what? Human-made chemicals, right? We're not going to run into this in nature.
They are almost exclusively man-made. So there is one type of fluorocarbon that exists naturally in nature, but the majority of the 9,000 PFAS that are in circulation today are man-made. They come from laboratories. They do not exist naturally.
All right, now take us from the Manhattan Project to this explosion in the number of products being made with various members of this long list of PFAS chemicals. How did we get from nuclear weapons research to this ubiquitous, this super common use of these chemicals?
That's a very good question. So after the war, a company called 3M, which is based in Minneapolis, acquired patents for technology to produce PFAS and also hired Manhattan Project chemists to help turn them into products that could be sold to manufacturers or marketed to the general public. And this led to innovations like Scotchgard, the fabric protector, an additive that 3M created made it possible to produce Teflon. And eventually, these chemicals found their way into thousands of everyday products. Some examples include contact lenses, baby clothes, diapers, dental floss, kitty litter, furniture, carpeting. The list is basically endless. So these exotic chemicals that were developed for the purpose of enriching nuclear fuels eventually became ubiquitous in our homes and lives.
We're talking to investigative journalist Mariah Blake about her new book. It's called They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals, talking about the PFAS category of chemicals. You've heard about them in the news here in Wisconsin. Mariah, you look at a couple particular case studies. One, kind of the first big public, I think, exposure to PFAS or to information about it in West Virginia. And then Hoosick Falls, New York. Can you take us in? Parkersburg was early. I don't think people paid as much attention to it. This Hoosick Falls story, though, you really focus on a lot of the people at the center of it. Why was PFAS there? What did you learn from the people you talked to?
Well, so there is a factory in Hoosick Falls that makes Teflon-coated fabric. Now, at the point the contamination was discovered there were only a few communities anywhere in the country that knew that their drinking water was polluted with this class of chemicals, although the EPA had been put on notice as early as 2001 that these chemicals were ubiquitous in the environment. But really, most places were not aware. There were very few communities that were aware that their drinking water was polluted. In the case of Hoosick Falls, there was this unassuming insurance underwriter named Michael Hickey who began to suspect that his drinking water was polluted after losing several friends and relatives to cancer. And his father had actually worked at the local factory that made Teflon-coated fabric and had died of kidney cancer. So at some point, Michael sat down and Googled Teflon and cancer and called up this massive health study that had been conducted in West Virginia, and it had linked PFAS to kidney cancer. Now, that factory happened to be right next to the wells that supplied the community's drinking water. And so he began pressing the mayor to test the drinking water for these chemicals and did not succeed. And so he tested the water himself and discovered astronomical levels of PFAS, so levels that are 100 times the EPA's current safety standard. He was spearheading this fight against several giant multinational corporations and government agencies to get his community clean drinking water. And other people had joined him in this fight, and they were a lot like him in that they were people who'd never taken much of an interest in politics, had spent their lives believing there were systems in place to protect them, and now that trust had been utterly crushed. But rather than being resigned, they fought like hell to protect their community. So largely as a result of these citizen activists, there's been a huge amount of state-level legislation on PFAS. There are currently 30 states have passed more than 155 laws, including, I believe it's 16 full or partial bans on the entire class of chemicals in consumer products. This is not the way we regulate chemicals in this country. We normally regulate them one by one. And there's also been, there's a huge number of lawsuits that have been filed, including several in the state of Wisconsin, one by the state itself and several by municipalities. You have huge shifts happening in the market. Huge swaths of the economy are voluntarily migrating away from PFAS. And in fact, 3M, which is the world's largest manufacturer of these chemicals, has announced that it will quit producing them by the end of this year.
That wasn't always the industry response. One of the side threads, I think you could say in the book, is how the industry reacted to these findings about PFAS in communities. And you compare it and see a lot of overlap with, for example, cigarette companies and how they knew their products were dangerous and how they approached that publicly.
So manufacturers, particularly DuPont and 3M, the two main manufacturers of these chemicals, have known since the 1960s that they were toxic. They knew as early as the 1970s that they were accumulating in the blood of people all across the country. And they eventually began looking at blood of people all around the world. So 3M tested thousands of samples from people in countries all across the globe, including remote rural China. And they looked at archived medical studies dating back to the 1930s and 40s. The only blood they could find that didn't contain these chemicals was collected from Korean war vets before 1952. So basically, before these chemicals went into mass production. Now, this set off some alarm inside industry, understandably, and they started intensively researching these chemicals. And they DuPont and 3M specifically, they quickly discovered that PFAS did not break down in the environment, that they were extremely damaging to lab animals. So in one case, they tested a certain PFAS on monkeys. The study had to be aborted because all of the monkeys died. These companies also used their own employees as lab rats. So they started testing the health effects of these chemicals on their employees and were able to establish by the 1980s that they were associated with certain kinds of cancer, with organ damage, with suppressed immunity, with reduced testosterone. But most alarmingly, they were found to be associated with birth defects. So in the 1980s, after a study by 3M had found that rats exposed in utero to a certain PFAS developed birth defects, specifically deformities of the eye, DuPont launched what it called a pregnancy outcome study. And as part of this program, it monitored the pregnancies of workers in its Teflon division. And as it turned out, 2 of 7 pregnant women who gave birth during the course of the study gave birth to children with facial deformities very similar to those found in the eyes of rats. But rather than inform regulators or the public or its own workers, DuPont simply canceled the study.
Mariah, as we wrap up, we've mentioned this is an issue here in Wisconsin, places like French Island in the western part of the state, Marinette Peshtigo in northeastern Wisconsin. Based on what you've seen from communities that responded and took action, if people are out there listening saying, yes, this is a problem, I'm worried about this in my community, what would you suggest to them on starting to push back and dig into this issue?
Well, the people that I've been following, they did whatever they could think of. So they spoke out in the media, they organized protests, they organized boycotts, they filed lawsuits, they demanded change from legislators, and they have made a remarkable difference. In the case of Minnesota, there was a young woman named Amara Strande who began testifying before the state legislature as it was considering a bill to ban the entire class of chemicals. She had been diagnosed with cancer at age 15, and she lived on a plume that was a groundwater plume that had been contaminated by 3M, and she died shortly before her 21st birthday. But 3 weeks later, the legislature passed the most aggressive PFAS legislation in the country. And there are stories like that that are happening everywhere. So individuals can really make a difference, especially on the state level. And I would just encourage, people in Wisconsin who are concerned about this issue to act, to encourage the state to be more aggressive in regulating these chemicals, because so far the state has not acted as aggressively as some other states.
Mariah, we'll leave it there. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mariah Blake is the author of They Poisoned the World, Life and Death in the Age of Forever Chemicals. Still ahead, St. Marcus Lutheran Church in Milwaukee marks 150 years. Its longtime pastor talks about how the congregation started in a schoolhouse in a new neighborhood.
At that year, in 1875, that one-room schoolhouse was on the very edge of town. There was nothing north and east of that one house on the block.
That's next on WPR News. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. Now it's time for Wisconsin Life. Here's producer Tyler Ditter with a story about finding your own way in life.
As a teenager, Marty Sosnowski never felt like he fit in, so he stopped trying to by not going to school altogether. At the time, he didn't feel like it was right for him, but later realized the importance of getting an education no matter what you become interested in. He talked about this with his sister Lynn Williamson during a StoryCorps mobile tour stop in Green Bay, Wisconsin.
This was 1974, I believe. I was just starting my junior year of school, and in those days, we got our report cards in envelopes that you used to have to bring home to mom and dad to sign. And so I started out my junior year with the first day of skipping the whole day. And one day of skipping classes turned into 2 days, turned into 3 days. After the first week, I thought, it's just the first week of school. I'll be cool. The next thing you know, it was the end of the first quarter, and I hadn't been in school at all. I brought my report cards home, had my friend who was a really good artist, and he pretended like he was a teacher, so he wrote all the grades and stuff. And it worked again for the second quarter. I brought my report cards home. Mom and Dad looked them over, signed them off. I took them back to school, gave them to the authorities, and everything was good. By now I have a job. I'm not going to school, so I have a job. So it comes to Easter break, and Mom and Dad were down at one of the local taverns. And so who do they run into but my counselor, Mr. LaFramboise? Yeah. He just walked up to him and said, well, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Sosnowski, how's it going? Where did you guys move to? And she was like, well, we didn't move. And he goes, you didn't? He goes, well, where's Marty going to school at? So they took me to truancy court. They put me back in school. And so I just started skipping class again, back into court again.
And then there was the period where you got asked to leave, basically.
Mom put my clothes out on the porch, and she was standing behind the door, and she was not going to open that door. She just told me to leave. So there I go.
Where did you go?
I ended up living in my truck for a while in Antigo working. I got a job up there working construction and had no place to live. I just lived in the front seat of my pickup truck. After my 12 years of school, I believe that I think it was 5 credits. But luckily, I had gathered enough information through all those years that I just went and got my GED. I switched it around. I was out of high school 9 years, went back to college, got my degree, graduated with a 3.59 grade point average, which I was extremely proud of. And then ended up, the reason I went to college is because I had picked up a camera and started taking pictures of rock and roll bands, and I wanted to work in the music industry, which you know, and I did it. And I did all those things and just ended up having the greatest life, which you know, now we all sit around and tell stories about it.
Yeah, we do.
Which are just the opposite, you know.
Where you started from.
I consider myself one of the richest people I've ever known in my life, and it's not because I made a ton of money working in the music business or anything like that. I'm not rich with dollars, I'm rich in my heart. I have my family, and I have so many friends, and I quit drinking and drugging and doing all that stuff and turned my whole life around and ended up living the greatest life a guy could ever have. I got to hang out with David Bowie, I got to hang out with Chet Atkins, I got to, you know, be part of that industry. The message I like to get out to people about that is, especially if you are like me, it's out there. There's so many people, so many teenagers that still struggle with the same things I did. It's just a little different world. But God, if you can just understand that it can be anything you want it to be.
Yeah.
You don't have to go down that road. You don't have to do that. You can totally change it around, and you can do whatever you want to do. You know, that was worth it to me.
That was Marty Sosnowski and Lynn Williamson. Their interview was recorded at StoryCorps, a national initiative to record and collect stories of everyday people. Excerpts were selected and produced by Wisconsin Public Radio. Wisconsin Life is a co-production of WPR and PBS Wisconsin in partnership with Wisconsin Humanities. Additional support comes from Lowell and Mary Peterson of Appleton. I'm Tyler Ditter.
This is Wisconsin Today. When St. Marcus Lutheran Church was founded in 1875, the surrounding city of Milwaukee had gaslit streets with horse-drawn carriages and wooden sidewalks. The church and the city have come a long way in 150 years. Its longtime pastor documented that history in a new book and a series of talks. It's a window into how Milwaukee has grown and the role that religious institutions have played in its neighborhoods. Mark Jeske was pastor at St. Marcus Lutheran Church for over 40 years. Pastor Jeske, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thank you. A pleasure to be speaking with you today.
How has St. Marcus Church been able to make it 150 years?
There's only one real answer, and that's, of course, our pastor would say this, the grace of God, God's kindness just helping us through many, many crises. And there were plenty of things that happened over the decades that could have broken people's spirit or driven everybody apart or could have started fighting over stuff and disintegrated. But we're still hanging together and flourishing because of God's kindness.
It's interesting how not only does a neighborhood grow up around you, a city grows up around you. What was Milwaukee like in 1875 when St. Marcus Church was first formed?
Yeah, the congregation began as a one-room schoolhouse. We were a daughter school that branched out from St. John's Lutheran Church, at that time located on 4th and Highland. So in the Deer District, about a half a block away from where the big taco is now, the Pfizer Forum. Mm-hmm. And they started a second school, probably to do some outreach because so many German Lutherans were flocking into Milwaukee in the 1870s. They wanted to basically build a catcher's mitt there to hold on to some of them. And at that year in 1875, that one-room schoolhouse was on the very edge of town. There was nothing north and east of that one house on the block. So obviously it's changed extraordinarily to the point where today it's considered one of the most densely populated inner city neighborhoods.
What did you learn while documenting these 150 years of history of the church that you didn't already know from your 45 years of service there?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say how bad things had gotten after the Second World War. That part of Milwaukee went through a dramatic demographic change. It very quickly went from almost completely white to almost completely black. And that was a bewildering social change. Whites did not know if they could trust black folks. Black folks most certainly did not know if they could trust white folks. White folks back in the early 50s weren't so sure, like they wanted black people to be saved, but they weren't so sure they wanted them to be saved sitting with them in their pews in their church. That for St. Marcus changed in the middle 50s. We had our own Montgomery situation in 1955, and that's when St. Marcus became multicultural. And the pastor at that time was absolutely determined that he was going to integrate the congregation.
Was there pushback when the school started enrolling more African American children and the church started confirming some of their parents?
I think some of the white people voted with their feet and they just said, this is not this was not what I signed up for. And they moved westward. They, I'm sure, stayed Christians, but they decided to get involved with a congregation farther west in the city. Most of the people, though, came to not merely tolerate it, but really embrace it. The people who did stay had a chance to get to meet the actual people, not just look at a different people group as a gigantic lump, but to meet people one by one and get to know the kids whom their parents were enrolling in the school. And I think it was a shock, but I think that the congregation decided we are now going to be a multiracial, multicultural congregation.
We're talking about the 150-year history of St. Marcus Lutheran Church in Milwaukee with Pastor Mark Jeske, who wrote a new book and is giving talks this month about its history in the city. Pastor Jeske, you are ordained in 1980 when the church is dealing with big membership declines. The school is also dealing with enrollment declines. What was it like to meet those challenges?
Well, first of all, I was too young and dumb to be as worried as I should have been. We were much closer uh, to dissolving than I realized at the time. I was naive enough to think if you just work really, really hard and pray like crazy and treat people kindly and with love, that we would start growing again. And well, we didn't die right away when I got there, but really, I the worship, the numbers of people in worship services did not really turn around from its 60-year long string, its negative decline. It did not really turn around till I had been there 6 or 7 years and then began to grow again. So the Lord had some real chastening and humbling to do first so that I wouldn't think I was a genius. I had to work a lot harder and do a lot of learning and listening first. But it did turn around for the congregation.
What are some lessons learned that can be applied today? Because we see churches and schools grappling with these same issues now.
It's crazy, but learning to enjoy a relationship with somebody who is not like you is not uh, obvious, simple, or organic behavior. It's always learned behavior. You have to learn how to do that. You have to want to do that. You have to choose to enjoy doing that. And the reason that many congregations today are still folding, and this is true of historic Black churches too, as their neighborhoods change, they are increasingly going to be facing that same dilemma, is that their new neighbors are not like them, like their demographic tradition. And it all comes down to two things. Do you know what you need to do to embrace someone not like you? And do you want to do it? And those two things are the only two questions that interest me. If you don't know what to do, that's ignorance, and ignorance is curable with information and inspiration. If you really don't want to do it, I think God in heaven just says, well, all right, I'll find someone else to do it for me, and I'll just let your organization die. And he seems very at peace with doing that if you do not wish to connect with people not like you. And I think that that's the secret sauce of our congregation, is that by committing to doing that, we committed to make ourselves uncomfortable 10 or 20% of the time. But that's when you learn things, when you're uncomfortable.
Do you think, though, that aspects of St. Marcus's history are representative of other Lutheran churches around Wisconsin, especially if they're in rural areas and not in the heart of a city?
Well, rural areas are maybe more potentially diverse than you might think. We have a ton of Native American reservations and tribal lands in Wisconsin, and plenty of Native Americans that live in towns near their tribal lands. And any Lutheran, traditional or historic Lutheran congregation that maybe was founded by Norwegian or German immigrants, if you're interested in connecting with people not like you, there are plenty of opportunities. But I would say on a congregation by congregation basis, this is hard because it disrupts the easy way of doing things when everybody is just like you. You have certain cultural assumptions that you don't have to think about, and you don't ever have to change the way you do stuff because you've been doing it that way for 130 years. There's nothing like an organized attempt to try to connect with people not like you, to blow up some of your assumptions and be willing to do things differently. Because if you're trying to connect with a new people group, you can't just say, well, we'll let you into our club, but the same old rules apply and we're going to do everything exactly the same. New people groups are not interested in a paternalistic attitude like that. The people who've been there longer need to come with the attitude, what can you teach us? Do you have some new ideas? What do you want to bring? And put them in charge of some stuff and let them do stuff their way. And if it's different, that's okay.
Pastor Jeske, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Glad you liked the book.
And congratulations on 150 years.
Thank you. Happy birthday, St. Marcus.
Mark Jeske was a pastor at St. Marcus Lutheran Church in Milwaukee for over 40 years. He was with us to share the church's 150-year history and its role in the community. You can find his free book and information about his history talks this month on the St. Marcus Church website or through our story on WPR.org. We're exploring stories of life-saving transplants ahead of a conversation Monday with two kidney donors who each gave their kidney to a stranger. We heard from Fred and Alma, who was diagnosed with acute leukemia over 20 years ago. Fred says in the email, I underwent a bone marrow blood stem cell transplant because the chances of survival were very slim. After the transplant, only about 40% of recipients survive 5 years or longer. I am very fortunate to be this far out. My older sister was my donor. Fred, thank you for writing in about your journey and how far you've come. There's still time to share your story of a life-saving transplant, whether you were the donor or the recipient. Email us at wisconsintoday@wpr.org, or you can call or text us at 888-642-0232. That's 888-642-0232. Wisconsin Today producers include Mackenzie Crummy, Colleen Leahy, and Lauren Cox. Our technical directors are Sarah Hopeful and Tyler Ditter. Learn more about us at wpr.org/Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent. You're listening to WPR News.